So when a government hires a company for some huge project, you'd think the contract they sign is the be-all and end-all, right? But in a huge part of the world, there's this kind of secret rule book that's always in play. It's a set of unwritten laws that gives the state some serious power, but also, surprisingly, gives the contractor a pretty amazing safety net. In this explainer, we're going to break down this massive difference in how government contracts work. To really get a feel for how this all works, let's kick things off with a super high-stakes scenario. The kind of thing that gives project managers nightmares. Okay, just imagine your whole budget is based on digging through soft ground, but instead, your drills slam into solid granite. Suddenly, your costs are exploding, your timeline is a mess, and the whole project is at risk. Now, if this were a private deal, the answer to who pays would be buried somewhere in the contract's fine print. But with a public contract, well, the answer completely changes depending on where you are in the world. And to understand why that is, we've got to look at this fundamental split in how the world even thinks about law, especially when the government's involved. So you can see this clear divide right here. On one side, you've got common law systems, like in the US and the UK. The basic idea here is that the law is the law for everybody, and that includes the state. The government is pretty much just another party signing a contract. But then you have civil law systems, and this is France, Latin America, a lot of the Middle East, and they draw this hard line between private law for regular people and a totally separate public or administrative law just for the state. And what that means is the state isn't your equal partner, it's a superior one. And this isn't just some random quirk of history. It comes directly from the French Revolution. See, before 1789, there were these powerful courts, the parliaments, that were seen as these old-school bodies that were constantly getting in the state's way. The revolutionaries were so against this that in 1790 they passed a law that completely walled off the regular courts from the government's business. And that's what led to a whole separate court system being built just to handle lawsuits against the government. This separate legal track creates something totally unique, with enormous consequences: the administrative contract. So, anytime a government in a civil law country is part of a contract, it automatically falls into this special bucket. It's not seen as a deal between equals. No, it's seen as a tool the state uses to get something done for the public good. And believe me, that changes everything. Because the state's main job is to look out for the public interest, it gets these things called exceptional powers. And get this, these aren't just clauses in a contract. They're mandatory law. They exist whether they're written down or not. This means the state can change the terms, stop the work, or even kill the entire project, all by itself without ever having to ask a court first. But, and this is a huge but, it's not a one-way street. In exchange for the state having all this power, the law gives the contractor one fundamental, overarching right: the right to the contract's financial equilibrium. Basically, the state can do what it needs to for the public, but it's not allowed to destroy the contractor financially while doing it. It has to keep that balance. So how is that balance kept? Well, the law gives contractors 3 mandatory remedies that exist outside of the contract itself. You can think of them as legal lifelines, always there, ready to be used. So this first lifeline brings us right back to our bridge problem, hitting that unexpected bedrock. This doctrine is called sujétions imprévues, and it's all about unforeseeable physical problems. Now, for this to apply, the problem has to be physical, it has to be genuinely abnormal, and something you couldn't have seen coming. And it has to make the job way more expensive. But if you check all those boxes, the remedy is just incredible. The contractor doesn't just get their extra cost covered, they are entitled to their expected profit too. The state has to make them completely whole. Lifeline number 2 is a shield against huge economic shocks that are completely out of anyone's control. This is the doctrine of imprevision, or hardship. This kicks in when something like a massive sudden spike in the price of steel just blows up the economics of the whole project, causing a huge loss. But here's a critical condition. The contractor can't just throw their hands up and walk away. They have to keep working. But if they do, the way the loss gets handled is pretty unique. Instead of one side taking the entire hit, the law basically forces them to share the pain. And as you can see here, it's not a 50-50 split, not even close. The contractor has to eat a small piece of the extra cost, usually about 10 or 20%, but the state steps in and covers the vast majority. We're talking 80 to 90%, all to make sure the project doesn't grind to a halt. Okay, the final lifeline deals with a really tricky conflict of interest. What happens when the government is both your client and the rule maker? This is called the Act of the Prince, or fait du prince.
This applies when the exact same government agency you signed a deal with turns around and passes a new law or regulation that just torpedoes your project. So let's say they change a zoning law that suddenly makes what you're doing illegal. If that happens, this doctrine lets the contractor claim full compensation for all their losses.
So, to recap this amazing toolkit real quick, for unforeseen problems from nature, you have sujet champs imprévus for full compensation, profit included. For unforeseen economic disasters, you get improvision for shared compensation. And for unforeseen government actions, you have fait du ponce, again for full compensation. Civil law literally has a specific mandatory fix for every major type of risk. So let's just pull the lens back for a second and look at the grand philosophy that's driving this entire system. This quote from the jurist Jean-Bred Delagrace just perfectly sums up the grand bargain that's at the heart of all these administrative contracts. It's really a trade-off: absolute power in exchange for absolute responsibility. What it all boils down to is this: the state gets this incredible flexibility to change, adapt, or even cancel projects because the public's needs are always changing. But in return, the contractor is shielded from the catastrophic financial risks that come with all that uncertainty. The whole point of the system is to make sure public services continue no matter what surprises pop up along the way. So the most important point here is that these two legal systems, common law and civil law, give completely different answers to this really fundamental question. One system basically says the risk is on the contractor, unless the contract specifically says otherwise. The other system creates a mandatory, state-funded safety net, and it forces us to ask ourselves what's really the fairest and the most effective way to build the stuff that our society completely depends on.